and all of the brave advocacy in favor of human rights, education, racial justice, civil rights, child care, early childhood education, and a long list of other causes. Joe is known to us for all of his personal traits of intelligence, energy, directness, good judgment, and humor. We have lost a great member of our community, and the Wyatt family has lost its patriarch, a tower of steadiness and strength. Claire joins me as we extend our hearts and prayers to Marge, Daniel, Lynn, Jonathan, and all the members of the family. Thank you very much.
What a pleasure to be here for Joe's party. It is exactly the kind of party that Joe would have wanted, and I just know he's enjoying it, as we all are. Pardon me. I'm Tricia Phillips, or as Joe always called me, Patwissa. I worked with Joe for at least the last 30 or 35 or 40 years. There is some debate amongst us all about how long he was actually with us and how long he was in our library. We were together both at the Hufstedler firm, where we were partners, and then later when we all went over to our wonderful law firm, Morrison and Forrester. I am honored to have been asked by Marge and the children to talk about Joe, the lawyer. Usually in celebrating the career of a lawyer, you start with law school. But here the story begins a little bit earlier. Joe, whose family traveled around a lot when he was a child, finally settled down. Where? Not in the law, but in the Army Air Force. Joe served for 3 years in World War II, something of which he was extremely proud. And during that time, he achieved the rank of First Sergeant. What better preparation for Harvard Law School? With, of course, a stop at Northwestern University. He graduated Harvard in 1949. He came to California, went to a political convention, he met Marge, and he stayed. This year marked Joe's 63rd year of practice. Amazing, absolutely wonderful. Joe continued to go to the office until just a short time before his death. Indeed, while he was in intensive care, he instructed his devoted secretary, Connie Rossetti, to call the folks in San Francisco to make sure that a case that Joe was in the middle of was covered. Life was work for Joe. He never would have quit, and of course he didn't quit. Joe began his career as a lawyer working with Walter Nossaman at the firm of Brady, Nossaman, and Walker. And their friendship continued for many, many years as they worked on books and other publications together. Joe then went to a firm which contained his name, Cooper, Wyatt, Tepper, and Plant. Early in his career, Joe developed a special expertise in the areas of estate and probate litigation, fiduciary tax advice, and appellate litigation in that area. He became so adept that he, along with Walter Nossaman, wrote the book on trust administration and taxation, a 4-volume tome that Joe single-handedly revised twice annually. This is one of those 4 volumes. Notice the yellow post-its. These are Joe's latest notes on the revision. Often, we saw Joe surrounded by books and articles working late into the night, concentrating on his latest revision. There he was. His back was always to his door, and the only sound that you could hear was the pen scratching on the yellow pad. One of Joe's mannerisms, as many of you will recognize, was twirling an eyebrow between his fingers saw him there with his pen, with his yellow pad, and going like this with his eyebrow, you just knew that he was concentrating and that he was trying to meet a deadline. Well, he met all his deadlines, but he never failed to recognize a person who came into his office. He never failed to greet that person, to offer a word of advice. He was there for everyone. I thought that since Joe's book on trust administration was such the Bible of the probate and trust crowd, many of whom are here, I thought that all of you would probably like to know a little bit more about the book and become familiar with it. So I'm going to quickly read the book, a chapter or two, and then there'll be a test. Just kidding. Joe just completed release number 84 in March of this year. On hearing the news about Joe, his publisher wrote to Connie, referring to Pub 470. I think that's the code name for the treatise. And it was actually a she, and she said that the pub won't be the same without Joe. Well, I concur in many ways, many more ways than just one. Joe was not much of a drinker, but there is no pub frequented by lawyers who relied on this publication that will not be affected by Joe's passing. Joe became a great friend and colleague to the old Hufstedler firm long before he became a partner with us, and that's what we have been debating back in the back there. He had an office in the same building as we did. Chuck Beardsley, one of the two founders of our firm, he and Seth, had tremendous respect for Joe as an estate litigator. Chuck had a fiduciary case down in San Diego Superior Court where he represented the interests of several minors who were beneficiaries of a very wealthy trust. Chuck brought Joe in as a fiduciary counsel to assist him. That experience became the basis for Joe not just using the library, but becoming a part of our firm. By that time, Joe was the recognized expert not only in trusts and estates, but in public pension fiduciary work. He was counsel to dozens of pension plan administrators, including, I think you'll all recognize these names, LaSera, CalPERS, the Judicial Pension Plans, the Los Angeles, the Kern, and the Contra Costa County Public Employees Pension Plans. He advised plan administrators throughout the United States. He was called upon to lecture throughout the states and abroad. Clients that Joe had didn't always want to hear what Joe had to tell them. Indeed, noteworthy in the area of fiduciary duties from a board of administrators to the pension holders that they represented is a case where MoFo, in the person of Joe and our former partner Mike Tumanov, handled in San Diego. The board of the retirement system wanted to take certain steps to spend the pension plan money in ways that Joe advised them against. Joe's advice was, as usual, straightforward and given on more than one occasion. Joe advised that the plan proposed by the administrators was contrary to the law of the state of California. Imagine such a thought. What did Joe get for this good advice to these pension plan administrators? He was fired. Later, an investigation found that the board had breached its duty to the trust in a multitude of ways, and the investigators cited the fact that Joe had advised the board that their plan of action was in violation of the law of the state of California. The report excoriated the members of the board for that action and called Joe's dismissal, I'm quoting, the silencing of a potentially dissenting voice. that of Joe Wyatt. Ultimately, the plan beneficiaries were well served by Joe's advice, as the board was found to have indeed acted contrary to the law. Joe was an expert in all phases of estate and trust planning. He was particularly wonderful when it comes to taxation. And I'm sorry to say that every once in a while he sided with the taxing authority, and we are all the beneficiaries of Joe's good work in those cases. Joe was known in estate and tax circles as the curmudgeon with the last word. After a healthy discussion amongst lawyers that went on all day, and all these lawyers having been practicing in this area of the law for a long time, they all knew each other, they all knew what they were going to say, they knew what their positions were. Joe would finally come up with a final point, the last word, just as things were wrapping up. His last minute points were always cogent and caused each participant to concede the merits of this final point, and then to revise their agreements accordingly. In these meetings, Joe was noted for his attention to and respect for the opinions of others, even the pontifications of others in the room, and there was plenty of that. Joe was never heard to say a nasty word or denigrate a colleague for even the most outrageous stance on a legal issue. Or at least if he did, one might not recognize it, for Joe often moderated his remarks by uttering the punchline in either Latin or French. I constantly marveled at his quick, dry wit and canny knack for getting at the heart of a knotty trust problem. The one anecdote that many people will recall about Joe occurred many years ago in the probate court of our courthouse downtown, the Los Angeles Superior Court. Joe himself told this tale often. So Joe is in court and he's heavy into an argument before the court, and at some point the judge brought him up short with the observation that Mr. Wyatt, in your classic textbook, Nossaman and Wyatt on trust, he had taken exactly the opposite position. Oh no, said Joe, Your Honor, it was Mr. Nossaman. Joe was a member of every bar association and committee that dealt with his field of law. He was always off to an ACTEC convention or an ALI or an ABBA or an International ALI ABBA ACTEC conventions. He served as a member of the California State Personnel Board, the Board of Administrators of CalPERS, and he served as an advisor to the restatement of trust. Law reform was important to Joe, and he served on the ABA Special Committee on Law Reform. In 1995, the Huffstedler firm made its final move when we became a part of Morrison and Foerster. At MoFo, Joe continued his work in advising public pension administrators, becoming without doubt the recognized expert in this area. Joe's secretary, Connie Rossetti, came with us, and she continued to work with Joe. I think Connie would agree that Joe was always a kind and considerate boss. He set a good example for younger lawyers. He never failed to remember Connie on special days. For example, Halloween was one of Joe's favorite special days. One Halloween, Connie arrived at her desk, and what did she find? She found a red-headed witch perched on her broom with a stunning repast of trick-or-treat raisins. Joe was very interested in ensuring that younger lawyers from whom he got help got appropriate feedback. Many of us, after either accepting without saying a word what the associate has done and then putting our name on it, or doing the blue pencil to it all, won't give any feedback to the lawyers. Well, that was not Joe. If he changed a young person's work, and he often did, he did so with a full explanation of why he had marked it up. And he did so in a tone that showed his kindness and eagerness to help the associate improve his or her work. He literally became enthusiastic about new points raised by associates, even if he never ever intended to use those new points. He could and he did wax poetic on the subjects of public employee pension plans, irrevocable trusts, interpreting many phrases in Latin. He made life and work fun. I am sure that today everyone who will speak will say something about Joe's garb. While Joe may not have been on the cover of GQ, he could always be counted on to show up in his perennial bow tie and his French beret. Often a plaid jacket accompanying these other constants of Joe's wardrobe. He liked, though, to dress for an occasion. Many of you here will remember the baby shower that we gave for one of the lawyers at MoFo when Joe forsook his beret in favor of a shower cap, which he wore throughout the party, lest anyone miss the pun. Joe and Marge were game for most anything. I mentioned that Joe served in World War II, and there he learned to speak French like a native. He loved to talk about his time in the Army Air Force, and on occasion he and Marge returned to France to visit. One time, while he was in Paris, Seth and Shirley Hufstedler happened to be marching by on one of their legendary walks, this time to Mont Saint-Michel. Joe met up with them on their way and walked for several days with these experienced walkers. Seth said that Joe did not complain of blisters or anything, although he did say that the other 8 people somehow or another got lost for a long time, but eventually he found them. After I left our favorite big law firm, leaving Joe and others there, Joe often copied me on emails when others in the firm would ask, does anybody know a family law lawyer? And Joe would call me to explain this, and the conversation would always begin, hello, Patricia. This is your partner, Joseph L. Wyatt. He always looked out for me. As you can imagine, many letters and emails have come in from those who work with Joe. The funny thing is that each person not only remarked on what a treasure Joe was for his contribution to the law and to the legal community, but every single thing that came in also praised him for just who he was. People loved Joe. I know that I expressed the sentiment of those who knew and worked with Joe, who read his books and articles, who were taught by him, and who learned from his blue pencil. And when I say that Joe Wyatt is irreplaceable, practicing with Joe was a joy and a delight. He had great instincts and a fabulous sense of humor. He was smart, and he was of the highest integrity, and he wasn't afraid to put his integrity on the line. Joe Wyatt was unique. The Bar of Los Angeles County will miss you, Joe. Thank you for giving us so much of yourself, and thank you to the Wyatt family for allowing me to try to portray some tiny part of Joe's 63 years as a lawyer in our community. Thank you.
My name is Teresa, and I'm here on behalf of Congressman Schiff and myself. Joe and Marge are friends of mine as well. Yesterday, on Monday, May the 6th, Congressman Schiff entered a tribute to Joseph Lucien Wyatt Jr. into the congressional record. I won't read the entirety of it because it's quite long, But if you do get a chance, please go to the Library of Congress website and check out the full statement. I would, however, like to read the last paragraph. Joe Wyatt was a very accomplished man, an admirable lawyer, and a great husband and father. He was principled, intelligent, humble, and humorous. He will be greatly missed, not only by his wife, Marge, and their children, but by the entire community. I ask all members to join me in remembering Joseph Lucian Wyatt, Jr. We will miss Joe. We love him, and we will miss him. Thank you.
My name is Peter Kelly. I met Joe in the summer of 1970 when I was a 22-year-old, very junior staff member of the California Democratic Party. I was a kid. Joe was a legend. Notwithstanding our age difference, from that summer day forward, Joe treated me like a peer and a friend. In retrospect, that in and of itself was amazing. I had the good fortune